Could the Falcons swing a blockbuster trade for Myles Garrett?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. So if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. Mr. AKA, and I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that is an everydayer that goes strong with me each and every day by making this illustrious podcast your first listen each and every day. And to become an everydayer, all you got to do, subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today we are continuing our positional reviews, looking at the interior D-line. We'll talk about how much is left in the tank for both Grady, Jarrett, and David Onyemata. What are the expectations for some of these young guys that are up-and-comers like Zach Harrison, Ruke Orhorhoro, Brandon Dorlus in 2025, and we'll talk about where's the beef. But we got to start today's episode with the big news of the day, and that is Myles Garrett, who announced via social media that he is requesting a trade from the Cleveland Browns. And of course, immediately all of our reaction is, who do I have to kill in order for the Falcons to make this trade go from a possibility to a reality? But put that blade away. Don't go out there on a killing spree just yet, right? Because just because Myles Garrett requested a trade does not mean that he will get traded, right? The Browns have already publicly said several times that they have no intention of trading him. Their GM manager, Andrew Berry, at the end of his 2024 year-end press conference basically said, we have all intentions of Myles Garrett retiring a Brown, right? Lifelong Brown. And you can think of some very prominent examples of players in recent years that have requested trades that did not get traded. Lamar Jackson 2 years ago. Trey Hendrickson last year has yet to be traded at this point in time. And then I think the other part of Myles Garrett's request for a trade is he wants to play for a contender. And that's the part that I think a lot of people, especially for a large chunk of the 31 other teams in the NFL, are forgetting in this conversation, where it's just like, oh yeah, we'll definitely be all in on Myles Garrett. And it's like, Myles is like, I don't think so, my friend, right? And the key part of his statement was the goal was never to go from Cleveland to Canton. It has always been to compete for and win a Super Bowl. So am I describing the Atlanta Falcons right now in terms of a team that's, ready to compete for and win a Super Bowl? For the record, the Falcons currently on FanDuel Sportsbook, proud sponsor of this podcast, have the 19th best odds to win Super Bowl 60. That is next year's Super Bowl, not this upcoming Super Bowl, obviously. So next year's Super Bowl, 19th best odds, which I think is about fair where the Falcons are. They're in the same boat as teams like Chicago and Denver and Arizona, Pittsburgh, Dallas, or whatever. Teams that are just like, we're just trying to make the playoffs. Making this Super Bowl run is not probably something that's in the cards, but we're just trying to get there. But, again, it's not impossible that the Falcons could go on a deep run in next January or whatever. All you got to do is look at the Washington Commanders as an example of a team that no one really thought going into this past season was going to be a contender and made it all the way to the NFC Championship game. And so, if you're in Myles Garrett's shoes, and you're saying to yourself, I want to compete for a Super Bowl. And, I don't think the next words coming out of Myles Garrett's mouth is basically what I'm saying is, and I believe the Atlanta Falcons are the team that's going to get me there. So I think the Falcons have to jump through a lot of hoops to get from where they are today to being in that conversation is basically the point I'm trying to say. And, Myles Garrett over the last 7 years in Cleveland, that team has won 53.5 games. The Atlanta Falcons over the last 7 years have won 47 games. So, from Myles Garrett's perspective, it's probably a downgrade to go from Cleveland to Atlanta based off of the last 7 years. But, we got Lisan Al-Gaib under center, so we'll see. But in terms of hypothetically what type of compensation you could realistically expect in the trade, I'm looking for something similar to the Khalil Mack trade. I know Myles Garrett's a little bit older than what Khalil Mack was when he was traded, but still, Myles Garrett And again, I know this is controversial depending on, if you're in the Bay Area or Pittsburgh or Dallas or, Las Vegas, some of these other cities. But Myles Garrett is the best pass rusher in the NFL, in my humble opinion. So I think you can demand, compensation for a 29-year-old defensive end like you would, like he's 26-year-old. But again, I think you would probably 2-1s and probably a day 2 pick, either a second or third round pick. If I'm Cleveland, I'm probably hanging up on any team that doesn't offer at least 3 premium draft assets, and 2 of those 3 being first round picks. And I would imagine if I'm Cleveland, if I am going to trade Myles Garrett and go back on what I've said multiple times now that we're not going to trade him, but I decide at some point in the future that we are going to trade him, I would certainly want to trade him to an NFC team. So, Falcons play in the NFC, if you didn't know. But I don't know if the Falcons would be at the top of that list in terms of, again, potential contenders. I think teams like Detroit, San Francisco, Green Bay, Philadelphia, Washington, the Rams are certainly teams that I think are probably able to have a much more convincing argument if they talk to Myles Garrett about, hey, you're that final piece to the puzzle for us and we're ready to go. We're already, teams that you can expect going into the season are going to be playoff teams that can, go to the second round or later, and you're that final piece that's going to push us over the hump or something like that. Again, I don't know if you're having that conversation if you're the Atlanta Falcons right now. So those are the teams that I would expect would be much more likely to trade for Myles Garrett than the Atlanta Falcons. But, I think you can certainly convince yourself, if you're the Atlanta Falcons, that Myles Garrett would be a huge boost for this defense. I don't know if he'd be the final piece, but he'd be a big step to, solidifying this defense. But Falcons still have holes at linebacker, corner, safety. Now you don't necessarily have the draft assets if you give them up to trade for Myles Garrett to fill those needs. And so therefore you need to be really aggressive in free agency. So if the Falcons are going to make a pitch, for Myles Garrett, then, I think it starts that first week of free agency where they're being very aggressive, filling some of those areas of need and being like, hey, Myles, we're ready to go, and whatnot. And we'll see on that front. But, I think the Luka trade in the NBA is causing people to think, hey, we could get a blockbuster trade of our own in the NFL. And I'm just like, I don't think we're going to get there. I fully expect the Browns to basically pour cold water on this and be like, Myles can say whatever he wants, but it takes 3 to tango in this case, because Myles wants to get traded. We need to want to trade him, and then another team has to come correct on that offer. And at this stage, I don't think you're going to get the second dance partner in the Cleveland Browns anytime soon. So we'll see how this is obviously a developing story. So, I'm sure there will be more news and opportunities, especially when we get to the combine, and, some of these teams and GMs will actually get to speak publicly and get asked these questions. And so we'll see on that front. But I would, fantasize about it all day, but in terms of how realistic it is for the Atlanta Falcons to be the team that lands Myles Garrett, I would probably pump the brakes on, going from the daydream to the reality. So we'll see on that front. But the Falcons, have some, real concerns, real world issues that they have to deal with on their interior D line, including, they have some aging veteran players like Grady, Jarrett, and David Onyemata. And is it finally time to sort of cut the cord and get younger at those positions? And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So the big game is almost here, and there's no better way to make it even more exciting than it already is than with PrizePicks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With over 10 million members and billions in winnings awarded, PrizePicks is going to make this big game fun and simple to get in on the action. Here's how it works. You just pick more or less on at least 2 player stat projections, and if you're right, you can win up to 1,000 times your money. And PrizePicks is even giving away a free pick for the game. All Patrick Mahomes needs is more than 1 passing yard, and you win. And if you pair that with 1 other correct pick, you're cashing out. I've already submitted my pair with Saquon Barkley more on 0.5 touchdowns. And so as long as Saquon gets in the end zone once, Patrick Mahomes gets in, throws 1 complete pass beyond the line of scrimmage, you've won money. And I'm giving you guys this advice for free. That's the beautiful thing about PrizePicks. It's not you versus other, members. It's you versus the number. So every single person that's listening to this podcast now can submit that on PrizePicks and win money this weekend. And, if you want to do that, make sure you download the app, use code LOCKEDONNFL when you do, and you'll get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5. PrizePicks, run your game. So the question along the Falcons interior D-line is about Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata. Both of these are veteran players, had a lot of success in this league over the last, decade or so. But both guys are on the decline. Now, I think between those two guys, I think Grady Jarrett has a lot more left in the tank comparatively. I think the Falcons will absolutely be justified in bringing him back. I think they will be less justified in retaining David Onyemata this offseason, right? I felt like Grady Jarrett played much better in 2024 than he played in 2023 before he got injured in 2023. I don't think that was the case in David Onyemata. That David Onyemata's 2023 season was much better than his 2024 season. And I think the two key selling points in terms of what Grady Jarrett still brings to the table, I think the leadership that he provides for what is likely to be a young D-line room. And I know, a lot of fans don't necessarily value that sort of stuff, but, NFL teams do. And their opinion matters a little bit more than yours, is basically what I'll say. And I still think Grady still has some juice as a pass rusher. He's not, one of the premier pass rushing D tackles like he was, 3-4 years ago. But I still think he's an above average starting caliber. I think he ranked like 60th percentile as an interior pass rusher this past year. Now, the issues are going to be both of these guys are on the wrong side of 30. Both of these guys have high cap hits in 2025. Grady Jarrett with $20 million. David Onyemata with $16 million. The Falcons could save $16 million against their salary cap by cutting Grady Jarrett. They could save $8 million against the salary cap by cutting David Onyemata. Again, I think cutting David Onyemata is kind of a no-brainer at this stage. But for me, I don't think Grady Jarrett is quite the no-brainer that maybe other people think it is. I think if Grady wants to keep playing in Atlanta, then you keep him and you find a way to restructure his contract. 2025, currently on his current deal, is the last year of his current deal. And so he'll be a free agent in 2026 after this upcoming season. I think, you do maybe a modest extension, right? A 1-year extension, get him, under contract for 2026, tack on, a couple of void years so that you can spread some bonus money around. And I think if you, depending on how you structure that type of contract, you could probably save anywhere between $10 and $12 million against the salary cap this year. Not quite the $16 million savings, but much more in line where Grady, you're looking at a Grady Jarrett cap hit around $10 million, which I think is much more in line with what his value is at this stage in his career. Still valuable, but not worth $20 million. And so that to me is the strategy I would like to see the Falcons employ. A lot of that depends on Grady Jarrett wanting to be back in Atlanta. If Grady Jarrett comes to the team, pulls a Myles Garrett and says, I want out, then, I think, you owe it to Grady to facilitate that trade. Unlike, I don't think the Browns will feel as compelled to owe that to Myles Garrett. But, it sounded like based off of his year end, on the locker room cleanout day that Grady enjoyed playing with the Falcons this year. Sounded like a player that wants to keep on playing for the Atlanta Falcons. So unless that changes in the next, couple of weeks, or he was lying through his teeth, and, Grady is not one to BS you. I think it's realistic to expect Grady Jarrett back next year. Now, when you look at the other guys on the interior, you have Eddie Goldman, Kentavious Street, Taquan Graham, all veteran players that are headed towards free agency. Goldman, I thought, did, excellent work for the Falcons at nose tackle. And I felt like part of the reason why the defense got better in the back half of the season is the Falcons stopped only asking Eddie Goldman to be part of their base defense, and they were actually allowing him to play in sub package, which I think led to improvements for the run defense, as well as getting another more effective pass rusher on the football field than some of their other alternative options at that position. The issue is, while I think Eddie Goldman played well enough, basically, to earn a new contract here in Atlanta, the problem is Eddie Goldman is Eddie Goldman. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with the Eddie Goldman saga these last couple of years, he has sat out football 3 out of the last 5 years. And that basically means if you do resign Eddie Goldman, even if he does tell you, hey, I want to run it back on another 1-year deal or something like that, there's a 60% chance that Eddie Goldman's not going to be on the team week 1. He's not going to show up. So based off of his history. So I don't think you can go into next year, even if you do want to keep Eddie Goldman, expecting Eddie Goldman to play, right? He's kind of the cherry on top. He's gravy at this point. If you understand my meaning, like if you get something from Eddie Goldman in 2025, great, but at no point should you expect to get anything from Eddie Goldman in 2025 at this point in time. So for that reason, I think you'll likely see the Falcons move on from Eddie Goldman this offseason. But when it comes to Street and Graham, I think both of those guys are valuable rotational pieces that can sort of give you more proven commodities and maybe some of the young guys that you're expecting bigger roles for. I would be open to the idea of the Falcons re-signing either one of those guys on cheap 1-year contracts. But to me, that's more something that I would wait till like the third wave of free agency in late March, early April. If feeling compelled, like I think that's around the time when the Falcons re-signed Kentavious Street last year. And so like that would be kind of where I would like 1-year veteran minimum type of deal. You know, if we're looking at the market and we're like, okay, it's dried up, you know, let's get another body in here, whatever, and let these guys compete and whatnot. Makes sense to me, but wouldn't be my first plan. I feel like you can get better options in free agency than either Kentavious Street or Taquan Graham, but I think both players are valuable depth pieces and rotational pieces. But some players that are going to be hopefully a bigger part of the rotation are some of the young guys, and I think the Falcons have been building towards this since drafting Ruke Orhorhoro and Brandon Dorlus last year. And we'll talk a little bit more about Zach Harrison and his potential fit as a starter for this team along the interior D line as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So if you're looking to get to more live events in the calendar year of 2025, then Gametime is the app for you because it's going to make it easier for you to get tickets to whatever live event you're looking for, sports, comedy, music, theater, whatever it is, thanks to their new feature called Gametime Picks, right? That's going to filter out the fluff and show you only incredible deals on great seats so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. And the other great thing about Gametime is, it allows for spontaneity, right? Where, you can search for last minute tickets. They all have all these different options in the app. You can toggle the all-in prices. Now, don't have to worry about hidden fees. You got the seat views, right? You got the Gametime guarantee, where it's basically if you find a better deal somewhere else, they'll refund you 110% the difference. It's all there for you in the app. So download the Gametime app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Again, terms apply. Create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Game time. So we talked about this yesterday with Zach Harrison, the potential if the Falcons do embrace more of a 4-3 front under new defensive coordinator Jeff Ulbrich. You could see Zach Harrison spending more of his time playing as a defensive end, an edge rusher, than on the interior. But I still stand by what you've heard me say many times on this podcast over the last 2 years, that Zach Harrison's natural fit in the NFL is a sort of classic 3-4 defensive end, that 5 tech, 4-eye tech. Like his game is much more Calais Campbell than it is Chase Young in terms of, fitting in on the interior than necessarily being a true blue edge rusher. I think Zach Harrison had another solid year 2, finished the year strong. I think he showed that he was much more comfortable and capable as a disruptor in the back half of the season, going into bully mode as we saw him in his rookie season. And so hopefully you can pick up where he left off at the end of this past season, and you can get some solid play from him as a starter. Looking at Ruke Orhorhoro, we saw flashes of Ruke. We didn't get too many opportunities to see Ruke play extended minutes outside of a handful of games this year. But when he got opportunities, I think he flashed excellent ability as a run stopper, occasionally would flash as a pass rusher. Brandon Dorlus, the Falcons' 4th round pick from last year, rarely had opportunities, but I thought did good work for like the 14 snaps that so whatever it was, the 11 snaps that we saw of him this year. And so I'm expecting bigger roles for Zach Harrison, Ruke Orhorhoro, and Brandon Dorlus. I know it was very frustrating for a lot of Falcon fans for those guys to see limited reps this year and how limited those reps were this year. And I'm expecting the Falcons to kind of open the door and be like, hey, these guys will have ample opportunity to earn significantly more reps. And again, assuming the Falcons stick with a 3-4 defense, which again, I think suits most of their current personnel. I think, players like Dorlus and Grady Jarrett probably, you could argue, fit better in the 4-3 defense. David Onyemata as well would be in that list. But again, because I don't expect David Onyemata back, I'm not really counting him in this conversation. But I think in a 3-4 defense, you go into next year with the expectation that Zach Harrison and Ruke Orhorhoro are your two starting defensive ends in that 3-4 front in your base defense. I think you relegate Grady Jarrett on a hopefully restructured deal to more of a designated pass rusher on third downs and whatnot. We saw Grady Jarrett play about 67% of the Falcons defensive snaps this past season. I would expect that number to be reduced and that number to be closer to 40 to 45% in 2025, which is more in line with a designated pass rusher in this league. You saw something similar from Solomon Thomas these last couple of years with the Jets, where he was primarily a pass rushing interior guy next to Quinnen Williams. And so I think if you were to reduce Grady Jarrett's workload by that number, you would probably be able to maximize whatever you have left in the tank for Grady Jarrett by reducing his rundown responsibilities and, prevent him from wearing down over the course of a season. Now, you're hoping that with, more opportunities for these young guys, you get a big year 3 jump for Zach Harrison. You get some big year 2 jumps for Brandon Dorlus and Ruke Orhorhoro. And if you do get significant jumps for those guys, it could do wonders for your defensive front. I currently am expecting those guys to be more rotational pieces, low-end starters in terms of what their production, rather than sort of being impact players on your D-line. But certainly, we will hope for the best in that regard. And I feel like, part of the reason why I was not as frustrated as maybe other Falcon fans were with the lack of opportunities for these guys, because I kind of always envisioned like, oh, their opportunities are coming in 2025 and 2026. And it's like, given the age of players like Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata, it was realistic expecting that one or both of those guys would not be back in 2025. And there would be ample opportunity for Ruke and Dorlus to get more playing time in 2025 than they got in 2024. Same thing with Zach Harrison and whatnot. And so it was all, to me, part of the plan. You don't have to necessarily like the plan, but like, to me, that's part of the reason why I wasn't necessarily as critical of this coaching staff for not getting more opportunities for those guys, because I feel like they're going to have, they're going to clear the runway for those guys heading into 2025, than they necessarily weren't willing to do in 2024. But we'll see on that front. But, when it comes to addressing some of the holes that you still have up front, I think you need to beef up that interior D-line, especially if you're sticking with the 3-4. You need that nose tackle to replace Eddie Goldman. You should have options to fill that hole in both free agency and the draft. I think my preference would be to double dip with a free agent and a draft pick, right? A plug and play free agent and then probably a day 3 draft pick. If you missed my Senior Bowl coverage last week, we talked a bunch about Florida nose tackle Cam Jackson as a potential option, later in the draft than necessarily some of the other bigger name, higher profile nose tackles that may be available on say, day 2 of the draft, like Deion Walker of Kentucky and whatnot. So we'll see how that goes. But, I think if you're moving to the 4-3, which I don't think the Falcons are likely to do, but if they do go down that path, I do feel like there's going to be much more of a premium put on adding not just beef to the interior of your D-line, but also getting a kind of a 3-down pass rushing D tackle to kind of take over for Grady Jarrett as that full-time difference maker. With, I think, Grady Jarrett being relegated more to a part-time role. And, I don't know if Zach Harrison and Ruke Orhorhoro at this stage can be expected to be that every down difference maker that is not only going to give you plus value on early downs against the run, but also, be a guy that you absolutely can trust on those, late downs as a pass rusher. Again, that's the hope, but right now they're not ready to do that. And so I think you need to go out and get that guy, especially if you're going to run a 4-3 sort of defense. And so when you look at some of these free agents that can bring that juice as pass rushers, you're looking at some of the guys like Milton Williams of Philadelphia, Osa Odighizuwa from Dallas, Levi Onwezurike, I always forget how to pronounce his name, from Detroit, Tershawn Wharton from Kansas City, Javon Kinlaw from the Jets, BJ Hill from the Bengals. If you're going for some veteran guys that, if you want to get another veteran in here to play next to Grady and whatnot, that may have some questions about, how much left in the tank. Although I would imagine that's probably not the road the Falcons want to go down, given the Matthew Judon situation, given they're already, pretty old on the interior. But, you have Javon Hargrave of the 49ers and Denico Autry of Houston that also makes sense in terms of guys that can bring that interior presence and be difference makers as far as pass rush goes. So if you're not going to be aggressive in free agency to get that guy, I do think you do need to be aggressive in the draft, and that potentially means that's on the board for round 1 or round 2 in this upcoming draft. Looking at a player like Walter Nolan out of Ole Miss would be a sort of an ideal option in that regard. So when I look at it, like if the Falcons are sticking with a 3-4, you can convince me that between Zach Harrison, Ruke Orhorhoro, Grady, Jarrett, add in 2 wide bodies and throw Brandon Dorlus in the mix, you have a pretty decent 6-man rotation in terms of your interior on 3-4 defense. I'm less in love with that rotation if you're moving to a 4-3, in part due to the expectation that Zach Harrison would kick out to edge. Brandon Dorlus might also kick out to edge. When we drafted Brandon Dorlus, I talked about how I think the ideal defense for him is a 4-3 defense where he can play, D end on early downs and then kick inside on passing situations and whatnot. And so, do you feel good with Ruke and Grady and then the 2 wide bodies as sort of your D tackle rotation on the interior? It's like in a 4-3 defense, it's like, okay, like you can make it work. It's not the end of the world. I don't want to sit here and be like, oh man, if the Falcons switch to a 4-3, their defense is going to be terrible or anything like that. But it feels it's less fun, or I guess you could say I feel less optimistic about that rotation in a 4-3 than I do in a 3-4. So we'll see if the Falcons, make that switch. I think another reason to stick with the 3-4 is so that you don't waste these years of development that these guys are getting, constantly switching fronts, right? Are you going to ask Zach Harrison to drop 15 pounds in order to move to be more of a 4-3 defensive end? And again, like, I don't think that's in his best interest at this point in time. Ruke Orhorhoro and all these other guys. So constantly switching the fronts and whatnot, is part of the reason why I don't think you've been as successful developing some of these day 2 and day 3 defensive linemen over the last couple of years with under Terry Fontenot. And so to continue down that road, I stick with the 3-4 and, figure it out from there. But we'll see on that front. Again, I do feel like the Falcons need more help, more beef at this position. We'll see how big a priority that will be for them this offseason. But when we talk about, potentially 5 or 6 starters on the defensive side of the ball, the edge rusher position, I think nose tackle was one of those potential starting spots that you need to look for. The beautiful thing is, when you're just looking for like a 2-down wide body, 320, 330 pound guy, there isn't as much a premium on those guys as there is on other positions. And so therefore you can get a decent starter for relatively cheap, which I think is something that makes total sense for the Falcons to go shopping for. Again, I don't think you're settling for that if you're moving to a 4-3 and you're like, oh, that's the last piece of the puzzle. And it's like, we'll see. So we'll see what the Falcons do along the interior D line. We'll talk more about the linebacker position, off-ball linebackers tomorrow, talking about Caden Ellis and, can the Falcons expect, anything out of Troy Anderson, JD Bertrand, and Nate Landman next year as potential starters, or do they need to go out there and find, somebody that can solidify that spot next to Caden Ellis in 2025? So that will be all in store for you tomorrow as we continue these positional breakdowns on the defensive side of the ball. Continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. Check us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, check out Locked On NFL to get the lowdown on what's going on elsewhere in the league, all the coaching hires, coaching changes. It seems like various reports that it's Kellen Moore's job to lose in New Orleans is the last head coaching vacancy. Get you geared up for the big game this weekend as well, with 2 shows daily on the Locked On NFL podcast. And of course, if you want to get more insight into the Browns situation, go check out Locked On Browns with Myles Garrett. And of course, if you're all still buzzing over the Luka Doncic trade, then go check out Locked On NBA, Locked On Mavs, Locked On Lakers, all that stuff and more. Go help out my guy Brad Rowland, Locked On Hawks, and all that and stuff. So it's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, guys. Your team every day.